Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. Welcome to our three nominees and their family members and guests. The nominees certainly will have an opportunity to introduce anyone they would like to. Today's hearing is in the hybrid format. Witnesses are in person. Members have, of course, the option to appear either in person or virtually. The committee is meeting to consider the nominations of three very, very qualified nominees. In fact, these nominees have the support. People who have contacted this committee, 1,000 individuals and organizations have weighed in support. I've never seen a number like that. We won not so long ago. We had 100 people weigh in, and we thought that was pretty overwhelming. This is 10 times 100, if my math is correct. The Honorable Sarah Bloom Raskin is nominated by the President of the United States to be Vice Chair of Supervision, a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Dr. Lisa Cook has been nominated by the President to be a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Dr. Philip Jefferson to be a member nominated by the President of the United States, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. In the first year of the Biden-Harris administration, we've seen tremendous economic progress. Record job growth, rising wages, fastest economic growth in 40 years. Last year, and think about this, last year, for the first time in 2 decades, our economy grew faster than China's. That's worth saying again, considering what this body did in listening to corporate interest outsource jobs to China for a generation, especially since 1999 to 2000, that our economy during the first year of the Biden administration grew faster than China's economy. Because of the action we took with the American Rescue Plan, because of this commitment, President's commitment to American workers, he puts workers at the center of our economy and our economic policy. We're making historic economic progress exceeding expectations of anybody, even the most partisan. We're at a pivotal moment in our recovery. The Omicron variant has caused COVID cases to increase in the last 8 weeks, further straining our supply chain. These pandemic-related problems are causing higher prices that eat away at America's paycheck. Your job as 3 future members of the Fed, and I do think you'll be confirmed, your job as 3 future members of the Fed is to deal with that inflation. The black unemployment rate's more than that, twice of white workers. Women are slowly reentering the paid labor force after too many were forced to leave at the height of the pandemic. As Fed Chair Powell said, getting past the pandemic is the single most important thing that we can do. Chair Powell is right. The action we take over the next several months will determine whether we have a truly robust recovery with lower prices, higher wages, plentiful job opportunities, distributed so that everyone has opportunities, whether we have that kind of truly robust recovery or whether our economy falters and Americans are denied the opportunity to emerge from this pandemic stronger than before. That's the fork in the road. And that brings us to today. We must have a fully functioning Federal Reserve Board, all 7 members, ready to meet these challenges, ready to ensure our economy continues to prosper. It's been almost a decade since the Federal Reserve Board, the 7 members, that we've had 7 board members. That's what makes this hearing urgent. That's what makes the importance of a vote on February 15th so important. Governor Bloom Raskin, Dr. Cook, Dr. Jefferson are the proven leaders we need at this critical moment. These 3 experienced public servants understand the importance of empowering workers through full employment, the need to combat inflation so paychecks go further. They are dedicated to Fed independence. I know that. They will uphold the Fed's dual mandate. I know that. A mandate to ensure that all Americans have job opportunities at good wages and to ensure that wage gains aren't eroded away by exorbitant prices. They know when we keep our financial system safe, when we support working families and Main Street businesses by putting workers at the center of our economy, then our entire economy grows. When we all do better, we all do better. Sarah Bloom Raskin is the President's nominee to serve as the Federal Reserve's Vice Chair for Supervision. I have not seen a nominee for a job like this close to being as qualified as Dr. Raskin. She was the Maryland State Bank Commissioner. She was a Federal Reserve Governor. She was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, number 2 position at perhaps the most important agency in the federal government. No one is better equipped than Ms. Raskin to protect Americans from risks that could bring down financial markets and institutions and wreck people's savings, from cybersecurity threats to climate financial risk. Throughout her distinguished career, Ms. Raskin has worked with the smallest community banks in the largest multinational financial institutions. She's worked with consumers and community groups and businesses, small and large, to keep our financial system safe. Unfortunately, regrettably, we have seen a coordinated effort by some to paint her as some sort of radical. That characterization requires a suspension of common sense. Remember, for her past confirmations, she has had the support of every Republican on this committee, every Republican on the Finance Committee. In fact, the entire Senate twice confirmed her, twice unanimously. Think about that. Sarah Bloom Laskin's been nominated to key economic posts twice before. Both times, every single senator, Republican and Democrat, supported her nomination. Now they're accusing her of some radical kinds of thoughts that don't have weight. As Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Ms. Bloom Raskin led the administration's effort on cybersecurity resilience for the financial sector, a critical issue that requires vigilance to protect our economy and national security. She understands that we need to think about all the financial risks our economy faces, including the possible economic impact of severe weather and climate change. As we heard from Chair Powell about the issues of climate, this is a priority for him and for the Fed. Looking at all the risk posed to our financial system isn't a partisan issue. Just ask Chair Powell. It's not some radical idea. Just ask Citi and Morgan Stanley. We saw in 2008 what happens to people's job opportunities and to their livelihoods, their home, their retirement accounts, their college savings when we ignore big risks. And we know the people that pay the highest price for that risk are people of color and women. Sarah Bloom Raskin will work to make sure our country doesn't repeat that same mistake. Dr. Lisa Cook, Dr. Philip Jefferson are the president's nominees to serve as governors. They're highly respected. They're experienced economists with sterling credentials. They understand how monetary policy can contribute to our economic growth and strengthen our economy for everyone. Dr. Cook currently serves as professor of economics and international relations at Michigan State University. She brings a wealth of research and international experience on monetary policy and banking and financial crises. That includes serving on the Council of Economic Advisors during the Eurozone crisis and past work with several Federal Reserve banks. She's done groundbreaking research on how disparities in our economy inhibit technological innovation and limit our overall growth. She knows the important role that workers and local communities play in our overall economic growth, from the rural South, where she was raised, to the industrial Midwest, where she now works. She's led the American Economics Association Summer Training Program, which builds the pipeline for diverse young economists to ascend to institutions like the Fed. A graduate of Spelman and school in Oxford and Berkeley, PhD, she is very qualified for this job. To give you a sense of Dr. Cook's impact, a mayor from my home state, Mayor Babcock of Oak Harbor in northern Ohio, wrote to me about her. He got to know Dr. Cook at one of those training programs, and he wrote, "I know her to be kind, qualified, and to understand the struggles and opportunities faced by Midwest communities like mine, where we're burying the term Rust Belt in pursuit of a bright future." Burying the term Rust Belt. We need a whole lot more people in institutions like the Fed who understand how ignorant that term is and misleading, and who understand that economic growth matters only if it reaches people like in Oak Harbor, Ohio. Dr. Lisa Cook will be that public servant. Dr. Jefferson's the Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of Faculty. Paul Freeland, Professor of Economics at Davidson College. He began his career as a Fed economist. Grew up in the shadow, as he told me on the phone, of RFK Stadium in Washington. He served as the chair of the economics department at Swarthmore College in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. Dr. Jefferson literally wrote the book on poverty and economics. His research on poverty will bring a perspective to the Fed that we need as we emerge from the coronavirus crisis. Just look at the diversity, not just who's sitting at this table. And we've never had a table of people sitting at the Fed like you. But think of the difference in perspective and attitude and upbringing and beliefs and emphasis and how that's going to serve all of us in this country. Listen to what the Washington Post editorial board wrote. Sometimes the board leans conservative. Think Privatization of Medicare, the Washington Post thought that was a great idea. The Iraq War, the Washington Post really thought that was a great idea. Trade deals that outsource jobs, the Washington Post always thought that was a good idea. So sometimes the Washington Post board leans conservative, sometimes they lean more progressive, but we all agree it's hardly a bastion of radical left-wing thought. Listen to what they wrote about these nominees. President Biden's latest nominees to the Federal Reserve, quote, are ready to help lead the Fed and bolster its credibility. The Senate should move quickly to put them in place. And early in my remarks, I mentioned the 1,000 individuals and organizations that support the three of you for the Fed. For the first time in a decade, almost a decade, we'll have a full board of governors at the Fed, one that reflects the country. We'll have public servants who not only steer us back on the road to normalcy, but who will reach for a stronger economy than before. The American people deserve a Fed that works for them. Our country codified the Fed's dual mandate of price stability and full employment with the 1978 Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. We know it as the Humphrey-Hawkins bill. And born out of the civil rights movement. For a decade, civil rights advocates worked for something like Humphrey-Hawkins. The law makes it clear that, quote, increasing job opportunities and full employment would greatly contribute to the elimination of discrimination based upon sex and age and race and color and religion and national origin, handicapped or other improper factors. This is part of the Fed's job. President Biden's Fed's nominees will ensure all workers that their families reap the benefits of the economic growth they create. These nominees will fight for the communities that have been left on their own far too often in this country, women and black and brown workers, to rural towns, to all the places derisively called the Rust Belt. I look forward to supporting these three nominees. I encourage my colleagues to do so as well. Ranking Member Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Raskin, Professor Cook, and Professor Jefferson, welcome, and thank you for your willingness to serve. We're here today, obviously, to consider three Fed nominees, but today's hearing is not just about vetting them. It's really a referendum on the Fed's independence and whether or not we're going to abandon a core part of our democracy. There are many people on the left, including in the Biden administration, who are advocating that the Fed use its supervisory powers to resolve complex political issues. What to do about global warming, social justice, even education policy. Now, these are certainly important issues, but they are wholly unrelated to the Fed's limited statutory mandates and expertise. More importantly, addressing those kinds of issues necessarily requires political decisions involving trade-offs. In a democratic society, those trade-offs must be made by elected representatives who are accountable to the American people, not unelected central bankers. The question's not about the merits of specific policies, but rather who should decide whether or not they should be put in place. Let's take global warming. If we further limit domestic oil and gas production, energy prices will rise. Americans will pay even more at the pump to accomplish the stated goal of decreasing emissions. How much more should they have to pay? If we move aggressively to limit energy production, but other countries don't, global warming probably won't significantly slow. Should we do it anyway? How much reduction in global warming should we get for the pain we would put the American people through? Let me be clear. This isn't about whether one believes that addressing global warming is important or how you would answer either of those or any other questions that are related. The point is, these are difficult choices which must be made by accountable representatives through a transparent and deliberative legislative process. That's how a democratic republic works. My concern about Fed overreach is not hypothetical. The Fed's already exceeding its mandates and engaging in political advocacy. For example, the Minneapolis Fed is actively lobbying to change Minnesota's constitution on the issue of K-12 education policy. Now, does anyone truly think that that activity is within the Fed's mandate? If activism by supposedly independent central banks accepted, then potentials for abuse by both parties is limitless. And don't just take my word about the politicization of the Fed. Let's consider what Ms. Raskin has said the Fed should do. She has repeatedly, publicly, and forcefully advocated for using financial regulation, including the Fed, to allocate capital and to debank energy companies. Now, Most other like-minded regulators have been very careful to say their goal is simply to assess risk. But Ms. Raskin has said the quiet part out loud. In a 2020 report from a progressive organization, Ms. Raskin urged financial regulators to adopt policies that will, and I quote, allocate capital, end quote, away from energy companies. In a 2021 speech at the Green Swan Conference, she proposed, and I quote, portfolio limits or concentration limits, end quote, on banks lending to energy companies. And in May 2020, at the height of the pandemic, she specifically called in a New York Times op-ed that she wrote for excluding a single industry, the fossil energy sector, which she called, and I quote, a dying industry, end quote, excluding them from the emergency lending facilities. Ms. Raskin's proposals would have devastating consequences, not just for energy workers, of which we have millions, but also consumers who would have to pay much more for energy. Now, on what basis could she justify this idea that the Fed should exercise these extraordinary powers? Well, I think Ms. Raskin sees two categories of climate-related financial risks. The first is physical, and the second is transition. Now, the actual data is very clear. It shows that physical risks, that is, the result of severe weather events, do not threaten financial stability. Economic damage from weather-related events in America, as a percentage of GDP, has actually trended down over the last 30 years. That's just a fact. And we still haven't found a single bank failure caused by any weather event. So it's pretty clear that banks are perfectly capable of managing the physical risk. But we're also told that banks need regulation that quantifies the transition risk from changing consumer preferences. Well, let me tell you, bankers know how to manage changing consumer preferences better than regulators do. Let's be honest, the real risk here is political, as Fed Chair Powell acknowledged last month. The real risk is unelected officials like Ms. Raskin, who want to misuse banking regulatory powers to impose environmental policies that Congress has refused to enact. Ms. Raskin has repeatedly and specifically advocated that the Fed allocate capital away from the fossil fuel industry as a way to combat climate change. She says the quiet part out loud. Now, turning to Professor Cook, the administration cites her role as a director of the Chicago Fed as a main qualification. That's a position she has held for 2 weeks prior to being nominated. She has a PhD, but no academic work in monetary economics. And the few times that she has said anything about monetary policy, it's been a cause for concern. Despite unemployment below 4%, inflation above 7%, and real wages for workers declining, in my conversation on Tuesday with Professor Cook, she refused to endorse the path that the Fed has decided to take finally to pull back somewhat on its easy money policy. The fact is, keeping monetary policy loose is going to continue to accelerate inflation that is rising faster than wages already. High inflation is a tax that makes everyone poorer, but especially low-income workers. I think it's also important to note Professor Cook's extreme left-wing political advocacy. She has publicly supported race-based reparations, promoted conspiracies about Georgia voter laws, sought to cancel those who disagree with her views, including publicly calling for the firing of an economist who dared to tweet that he opposed defunding the Chicago police. And after we highlighted these tweets for the public's attention yesterday, Professor Cook blocked the Banking Committee Republican Twitter account. Apparently, Professor Cook realizes how inflammatory her partisan tweets have been. See, the Fed is already suffering from a credibility problem because of its involvement in politics and its departure from its statutorily limited and prescribed role. I'm concerned that Professor Cook will further politicize an institution that has to remain apolitical. Finally, Professor Jefferson, thank you for coming to my office and for the conversation that we had on Tuesday. I enjoyed and appreciated our discussion, and I admire your decades of work on macroeconomic issues, very much including monetary policies and issues that are central to the Fed's important work. Based on Professor Jefferson's academic credentials, his written work, and my meeting with him, I think Professor Jefferson is well suited to the position for which he's been nominated. Let me conclude by addressing my Democratic colleagues. You folks have spent the last several months talking about how passionately dedicated you are to democratic principles and values, and I don't doubt that you've been sincere about that. But certainly one of those principles is that the unelected governors of America's central bank shouldn't be responsible for dealing with the difficult issues like global warming and social justice and education policy. This is not about the importance of those issues. It's about keeping the Fed apolitical and independent and ensuring that elected, accountable representatives make the difficult decisions. If that doesn't convince you, I would urge you to remember that one day the shoe will be on the other foot. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Would the three witnesses rise, please, and raise your right hand? You swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God. Do you agree to appear and testify in front of any duly constituted committee of the Senate? Thank you. Please be seated. Again, we welcome the three of you to the committee. If you'd like to introduce family members or friends with you today, I invite you to do that at the beginning or during your testimony. Ms. Bloom-Raskin, please begin your testimony. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. Thank you also to your exemplary staff who provide essential support, something I know from serving this committee as banking counsel. With me today is our daughter, Hannah Grace Raskin. There she is. Hannah is a real live banker, and we have animated conversations about banker-like topics, such as what goes into the numerator for the allowances for loan loss reserves and what gets subtracted out of net interest margins. Our other daughter, Tabitha, teaches middle school algebra. She would have been here, but for the fact that today is review day before the exam for slope and intercept equations. Our son, Tommy, who we lost in 2020, is with me always. He came into the world when I worked for this committee. I remember where I was standing, actually, in these very offices in 1995 when he started kicking as I went into labor. And I remember returning to these halls to show my friends here my sparkling little boy. Boundless gratitude, too, to my beloved husband, Jamie, who provides bedrock strength and love to our family. As a child growing up in Illinois, my family made a weekly Saturday morning pilgrimage to the Bank of Homewood, where my mother would withdraw money for the week. From this experience, the importance of banks to the economic well-being of a community was never lost on me. As my brother and I eyed donuts in the lobby, my mom would direct us to get in line for the right bank teller. This line, she would say, we want Shirley. We would get weekly updates on Shirley's children, their Little League games, bowling scores, and family camping trips. In 2007, I was honored to become Maryland's State Banking Commissioner, which enabled me to demonstrate my lifelong appreciation for community banking. Later, I was confirmed by the Senate to be a governor on the Federal Reserve Board from 2010 to 2014, and Deputy Treasury Secretary from 2014 to 2017. I also worked in the private sector as a banking lawyer and general counsel. I'm proud of my work at the federal and state levels to champion the interests of consumers and community banks while ensuring the resilience of our financial system, particularly in the areas of cybersecurity and appropriately tailored rules. These experiences helped me understand the importance of bank supervision to the ability of our financial system to work for all Americans. I also learned from the subprime mortgage crisis, which cost us tens of millions of jobs and homes and trillions of dollars lost to our families, businesses, and communities in equity and savings. Like the crises before it, the subprime mortgage crisis showed how weak regulatory oversight and unattended problems can reverberate, rattle, and ravage our entire economy. I learned that to be effective for all Americans, bank supervisors must make sure that the safety of banks and the resilience of our financial system are never compromised in favor of short-term political agendas or special interest groups. They must stay attentive to risks no matter where they come from, inside or outside the financial sector, well-identified asset bubbles or speculation, a set of threat actors that launch cyber attacks, or from nature and cataclysmic weather-related events. As created by Congress, the role of Vice Chair of Supervision requires consultation with other governors of the Federal Reserve, the Fed's expert staff, the banks themselves, and other experts about the extent to which financial institutions are identifying, analyzing, and managing their risks. The role does not involve directing banks to make loans only to specific sectors or to avoid making loans to particular sectors. And the role exists within the laws passed by Congress that govern the Federal Reserve and its responsibilities. I understand that anyone confirmed to this position must act not only with as much knowledge as possible, but also with humility. Knowledge, especially about the future, can be imperfect. Finally, I want to recognize the toll inflation exacts on working people who are concerned about how far their paychecks will go for essentials like food, housing, and transportation. It's an important task of the Federal Reserve to reduce inflation, and one that must be a top priority while we continue to sustain our economic growth. If confirmed, I commit to pursue this work with the highest ethical standards. I look forward to meeting the considerable challenges and opportunities before us, the indispensable work of defending and safeguarding the financial sector, the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, and the economic future of all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Raskin. Dr. Cook, you're recognized to begin your testimony. Thank you.
Senator Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and other members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today. I am humbled and honored to have been nominated by President Biden to be a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. I earned my PhD at Berkeley, served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and have spent decades teaching, studying, and researching economic growth and monetary policy. The depth and breadth of my experience in both the public and private sectors qualify me to serve as a Federal Reserve Governor. And should I be confirmed, I would be honored to work with my colleagues to help navigate this critical moment for our nation's economy and the global economy. In terms of priorities, I agree with Chair Powell that our most important task is tackling inflation. High inflation is a grave threat to a long-sustained expansion, which we know raises the standard of living for all Americans and leads to broad-based shared prosperity. That is why I am committed to keeping inflation expectations well anchored. My approach to complex problems is to be guided by facts, data, and analysis, and to work collaboratively. I have served in the administrations of presidents from both parties, and when I make decisions, I do so based on the facts and not politics. In this respect, I will follow the example of Paul Volcker, whom I greatly admire for his unwavering dedication to a non-political and independent Federal Reserve. My convictions are shaped by my upbringing in Milledgeville, Georgia. It was a desegregating South, and both sides of my family were promoting nonviolent change alongside our family friend, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., while my sisters Pamela and Melanie and I were integrating our schools and pools. My parents were integrating their places of work. My mother, Professor Mary Murray Cook, and my aunt, Professor Loretta Murray Braxton, integrated their universities and STEM departments by gender and by race, preparing students for a desegregating South that promised greater opportunity for all. My cousin Floyd McKissick Sr. spoke at the March on Washington and integrated the University of North Carolina Law School. My uncle, Dr. Samuel Du Bois Cook, studied with Dr. King at Morehouse College, was a first African-American tenured professor at a Southern university, and later was president of Dillard University. I want to thank Senators Warren, Kennedy, and Tillis, as well as the many other senators who honored my uncle in a Senate resolution upon his death in 2017. The sense of discipline, hope, and mission instilled in me by my family has taken me from Spelman College to Oxford University, the Hoover Institution, and Harvard, but I've never forgotten where I came from and the dedicated teachers who supported me. I chose to seek my current tenured position as a macroeconomist in the industrial Midwest in this same spirit of being close to how our economic decisions affect working families. Living in a manufacturing hub during the financial crisis has underscored the effect that deep recessions have on everyday lives. And this is one reason I have dedicated much of my career to preventing the next financial crisis. A strong and resilient financial system supports American families, businesses, and our economy. My research on economic growth has been informed by my interactions with families, businesses, policymakers, and financial institutions. I have extensive experience working for many types of banks, including serving on the board of a CDFI in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I am particularly proud that community banks were among those who elected me to serve on the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Indianapolis. I have also worked closely with the Federal Reserve over the course of my career, conducting research at reserve banks before and receiving my doctorate, attending policy conferences, and serving on advisory panels, and as a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. There is still much to learn to make sure the Fed does its job even better. Our economy is constantly evolving. Learning to do better will require humility, perseverance, and diverse perspectives. Again, it is an honor to be considered for this position, and I look forward to working with members of this committee. If confirmed, I will faithfully support the congressionally mandated goals of stable prices and maximum employment, which Congress has entrusted to the Federal Reserve. Thank you. And I'd like to thank my Aunt Wivona Ward from Virginia Beach, Virginia, and my sisters Pamela Cook and Melanie Cook McCant for escorting me here today.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Dr. Jefferson, you're now recognized to begin your testimony.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I am honored to have been nominated by President Biden to serve as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. If confirmed, I would draw upon my background and skill set to contribute positively to the well-being of the American people by helping the Federal Reserve to adhere to the dual mandate set for it by Congress: promotion of maximum employment and stable prices. As some of you may know, I was born and raised here in Washington, D.C., in the Northeast section, just blocks away from Robert F. Kennedy Stadium. The neighborhood is called Kingman Park, and in my youth, it was a place where the line between a future of success and struggle was thin. The Capitol is a mere 25 blocks from the row house where I grew up. My first job after graduating from college was here in Washington, D.C., as a research assistant for the Board of Governors. Since that time, I have been fortunate to pursue a career that spanned a valuable combination of experiences, both within and outside academia. I have served as a professor of economics, department chair, college dean, college vice president, president and director of various professional organizations focused on economics, a college trustee, a borough council member, and have held additional professional roles within the Federal Reserve System. In the leadership positions that I have held, the essential qualities for success have included a spirit of collaboration, a capacity to compromise, and the ability to achieve consensus. Further, I am a PhD economist with an unusual combination of specializations: macroeconomics and monetary economics, poverty and economic inequality, and applied econometrics. If confirmed, these specializations will enable me to analyze from multiple perspectives the complex issues that come before the board. Today, the economy is facing two major challenges: the COVID-19 pandemic and inflation. The pandemic has disrupted the supply side of the economy and changed the composition of aggregate demand. The spike in inflation we are seeing today threatens heightened expectations of future inflation. The Federal Reserve must remain attentive to this risk and ensure that inflation declines to levels consistent with its goals. The mandates set by Congress for the Federal Reserve have served the American people well. As we know from experience, the pursuit of maximum employment and stable prices fosters an economic environment characterized by a dynamic labor market, entrepreneurship, private saving and investment, and sustainable growth in consumption and production over the long run. Importantly, the dual mandate provides a critical foundation for monetary policy amid our current challenges and those that lie ahead. The tools of monetary policy can be deployed with clear goals in mind. Adherence to these goals will ground inflation expectations appropriately so that policy itself does not encumber private economic decision-making. Further, long-run inclusive prosperity requires that the Federal Reserve pay careful attention to the safety and soundness of banks and the stability of the financial system. Before closing, I wish to acknowledge the love and support of my friends and family, especially my sons, Nathan, who's watching remotely, and Miles, who happens to be right here with me. Also, I wish to mention my late parents, Wade Jefferson and Joan and Walter Coates. Who worked so hard and gave so much so that this improbable day might even be possible. Regardless of the outcome, they would have been so very proud of these proceedings. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. It is a real honor. I look forward to and welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Jefferson. Governor Bloomer, I can start with you. Many of us are familiar with your work at Treasury on cybersecurity, applauded by the financial industry to keep the government agencies and industry connected with up-to-date information on cyber threats to the financial sector. You know firsthand how important it is to protect working Americans from risks in our financial sector, in financial system, and that's the job of the Vice Chair for Supervision. Confirmed, how would you approach evaluating all the risks to our financial system?
Well, Chairman Brown, thank you for that question. Banking regulators are centrally concerned with the management of risk in the banking system, which we know over the course of American history has been subject to numerous shocks and crises. So whatever the risk, whether we're talking about the risks of cyber attacks, whether we're talking about the risks that come from climate-related extreme weather events, The job of the banking regulators is to make sure that the banking system has appropriately accounted for these risks and is prepared to mitigate them. Now, the watchword here is resiliency, resiliency in the face of potential risk. So I know there's been a lot of speculation about this. So I want everyone to understand kind of three basic principles that define my approach to the Federal Reserve's regulatory and supervision of risk. Okay, so first, it is inappropriate for the Fed to make credit decisions and allocations. Banks choose their borrowers, not the Fed. It's inappropriate for the Fed to choose winners and losers. Doing so is not the proper institutional role of the Fed. That's a cardinal principle of Fed supervision. Second, regulation is best achieved when it is collaborative. My practice is to bring all interested parties and experts to the table and to listen carefully before making consequential regulatory decisions. This approach has been my hallmark since my time as the Maryland Commissioner of Financial Regulation, and it has been the crux of my effectiveness as a regulator. Third, supervisory and regulatory actions must always stay within the bounds of the law. They must stay within the bounds of the Fed's authority as Congress has set forth. All actions have to stay within the Fed's statutory mandates. I understand Congress's strictures and authorities and have always acted within them. So, in my 4 years as a Fed governor, as my years as a Maryland Commissioner of Financial Regulation, as my years as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, I have never deviated from these three principles guiding our regulatory and supervisory processes. And I can't think, really, of a single moment when anyone would accuse me of having deviated from them. Again, I know them, I understand the role, I understand the law. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor. Dr. Cook, you grew up in a small town in Georgia, not far from where my mom grew up. You teach in the industrial Midwest, not far from really where I live. You served as an economist in administrations, Democrat and Republican alike. How has that shaped your view of monetary policy? And as you answer that, tell us how the Fed can create conditions for investment in good local jobs.
Thank you for that question, Senator. Growing up in rural Georgia and being an economist in the industrial Midwest have both shaped the way I think about the dual mandate, maximum employment and stable prices. One of the most shocking events of my career has been to teach macro in fall 2008 and sit in my office and look outside and see a long line. Where was that long line from? I had no idea. I asked a colleague, and the colleague told me that there was a food pantry, and this long line that looked like it was straight out of the Great Depression, straight out of the Dorothea Lange portfolio, was our students. Their parents had lost their jobs. They had lost their jobs. They should be studying. At that time, I decided that all of the skills that I have, the ones that I've acquired, the ones that I've acquired through experience, through research, would be devoted to eliminating risk associated with financial and economic crises. So that's what shapes my view with respect to monetary policy. Where does that experience come from? That experience comes from sitting on the board of a CDFI. It comes from sitting on the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. It comes from interacting with firms and businesses and everyday people throughout the Midwest. So I'm keenly aware of the challenges that everyday Americans face and I am keenly aware of the types of capital, for example, that don't flow to those places easily. So my work on the Federal Reserve, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Indianapolis has been really important in trying to get capital to capital-scarce places and to capital-scarce sectors. So that's what shapes my views on monetary policy.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Dr. Jefferson, we all know the pandemic's devastating impact on our country, especially on low-income workers and families who are already struggling. As a former Fed economist who's written extensively on the economics of poverty and inequality, discuss how the Fed can minimize the pandemic's lasting impact on low-wage workers.
Thank you for that question, Senator. The way in which the Fed, within its authorities, can best improve the recovery from the pandemic for low-wage workers is to stick to its dual mandate, which is to keep a focus on maximum employment and stable prices. Because, Senator, what we learned from the long expansion that we were enjoying before the pandemic is that over the long run, non-inflationary growth is itself very inclusive. It allows people from all parts of the wage distribution to participate in our economy. So what the Fed can do is create the macroeconomic conditions for long-run non-inflationary growth.
Thank you. Senator Toomey, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with Professor Jefferson. Thanks for coming by my office and for our discussion recently. During the course of our conversation, you said to me, I think this is pretty close to a verbatim quote, that the Fed board has no role in the allocation of capital, period, end quote. So just for the record here this morning, is that a fair characterization of your view?
I stand by that quote, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Raskin, I've heard what you've said this morning. I saw your testimony. But from your repeated speeches, op-eds, podcasts, all kinds of sources, right up to very recent times, it seems very clear to me that you believe that climate change is a very, very dire, imminent threat, that it will be catastrophic. I think you've used the word existential, and that for those reasons, it is necessary and appropriate for financial regulators, including the Fed, to allocate capital away from those companies that are contributing the most to the carbon in the atmosphere. Isn't that true?
Thank you, Senator Toomey. It is inappropriate for the Fed to make credit decisions and allocations based on choosing winners and losers. Banks choose their borrowers. The Fed does not. It is inappropriate for the Fed to choose winners and losers, and to do so is not the proper institutional role of the Fed. That is, as I said, a cardinal principle of Fed supervision.
Okay, I hear you say this, but the problem is the huge documented weight where you have said something very, very different. In the Financial Times in January of 2021, you wrote an op-ed. In that you said, and I quote, "Next, the financial supervisors will need to know how to act on this information. Supervisory adjustments will have to take climate disclosures into account, and the Fed will need to use climate risk data to make decisions on asset purchases," end quote. At UC Berkeley, at a forum speech that you gave in April of 2021, you said, and I quote, "I have come to a singular recognition, and it is this. In order to maximize the speed and safety of a move into a sustainable, durable, net zero economy and away from climate change disaster, we need to use the financial regulatory apparatus to engage financial markets and financial institutions in affecting both direction and pace," end quote. In June of 2020, the Saris report came out, and you wrote, and I quote, "At the very least, we must rebuild with an economy where the values of sustainability are explicitly embedded in market valuation. This transformation will come in part from urging the leaders of our financial regulatory bodies to do all they can," which turns out to be a lot, "to bring about the adoption of practices and policies that will allocate capital and align portfolios towards sustainable investments that do not depend on carbon and fossil fuels," end quote. How is that not advocating that regulators pressure the financial institutions to allocate capital the way the regulators want?
Well, it is, of course, not the role of the Fed to be directing credit allocation. They do not choose winners and losers. The way supervision works is by looking at risk, and by looking at risk wherever it may arise. You look at that risk, and you have to do it in a very, honest way, and ask yourself whether there is any correlation between that risk and the ability to hurt a financial institution.
Are you saying you no longer hold these views that you've stated about allocating capital as a result of your perception of this risk?
My views have been consistent, Senator. The Fed should not pick winners and losers. They should not be exposing taxpayers to undue risk.
Well,
so
okay, that I'm sorry, that there is no reasonable reading of these articles and speeches that can come to a conclusion other than that you want to be allocating capital away from those industries that are generating large amounts of CO2. I'm sorry, I know you're saying something different here this morning, but that's not what you've been saying in writing for several years now. Let me move over to Professor Cook. I've heard you talk about the importance of getting inflation under control. But we had a phone conversation a couple of days ago. In that conversation, I specifically asked you whether you agreed with and supported the Fed's recent decision to gradually begin the process of removing the ultra-easy money policy, or whether you thought they were acting prematurely. And what you said was, well, somewhere in between. So I'm wondering if you can clarify that. Well, let me ask a simple question. Do you now support the Fed's current path of accelerating the tapering and moving on to a series of interest rate increases over the course of this year?
Senator, thank you for that question. I am certainly, when I think about these issues, I would like to look at the data and evidence that would be at one's disposal, if confirmed, to be able to make a decision about this. So I did say it was somewhere in between before, and I agree with the Fed's path right now as we're speaking. But when we get to a decision point, I would look to the data, the evidence that would be made available at that time.
Okay, well, there's a tremendous amount of data that's out there, right? I mean, there's no secrets or mystery about what the Fed's monetary policy is at any point in time. There's no secret or mystery about economic data generally. There's thousands of people across the country that are constantly analyzing it. It seems you've shifted from the in-between answer to now saying you support what the Fed's doing. It's confusing to me, and so could you give us some sense of how you view the policies that are available to the Fed, how you think about what we should be doing at this moment, have your thoughts on the Phillips curve change given the developments in recent years? Are you concerned about the change in what's happening with the shape of the yield curve? Do you think exchange rates are an important mechanism? How do we get inflation under control?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I understand that every day Americans are suffering from high inflation. This is something that I learned a lesson about more recently, probably than most people. I've lived in countries and advised countries in a situation of hyperinflation. So I am motivated by seeing the suffering of workers, of businesses, and just trying to plan their everyday lives and facing an inflationary environment. The way I would think about it would be, along with, if confirmed, along with the deliberation. So you're right, there's a lot of data available, We don't have access to all the data the Federal Reserve has, but we have a lot. And what we don't have access to is the deliberations at the time that they're being made. And I work collaboratively. I'd like to hear arguments as they are being made. And with respect to the shape of the Phillips curve, what we know in economics is that this is an open research question. We know that there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but we don't necessarily know what that relationship is. And in times of uncertainty, and this is sort of my specialty, in places of uncertainty, in emerging markets and developing countries, what we know is that we have to be patient with the data. We have to ask about the data, whether the data have changed, if they are reliable, and still valid. So I would make sure that I pose questions of the data we were receiving and engage with the deliberations with my colleagues with an open mind, if confirmed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Senator Reed from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you very much. Ms. Raskin, in your opinion, is the banking community more and more aware of the impacts economically on climate change and taking steps to alter their behavior?
Well, thank you, Senator Reed, for that question. In conversations with bankers, over the course of my years, I open conversations with discussions of risk. What are they seeing as emerging risks? What are they concerned about? I would say the number one issue that they talk to me about has been in the realm of cyber security. When I ask bankers, what keeps you up at night, it's usually the sense of being under constant threat of cyber attacks. They, you wonder, like, why is it the financial sector that seems to have a target on its back when it comes to cyber attacks? That's where the money is, right? So it would be, you would be really amazed to learn how much money banks have spent actually trying to defend themselves against these cyber attacks. They have set up war rooms where they are in constantly trying to fend off the constant threat of a cyber attack. And why does it matter? It matters because it can actually destabilize a financial institution. In the early days of cyber attacks, you saw banks actually just have to shut down in very brief moments. As the cyber attacks have become more voluminous and more varied in their methods and in their vectors, you start to see now a pattern by which the cyber intrusion has moved into the deep recesses of the bank's plumbing, and this actually has presented greater risk. So, cybersecurity, and this, by the way, has been one of the sort of hallmarks of the work I did at the at Treasury, where we attempted to put together sort of a five-pronged approach to work with the financial sector, help the financial sector defend itself against cyber attacks. And we did this through various approaches having to do with enhancing baseline protection, information sharing, response and recovery, deterrence, figuring out how to prioritize and coordinate. This was work that also brought into play law enforcement and the national security apparatus. So to do cybersecurity, to deal with this risk effectively, I think requires a multi-sector approach. And once, we also know we have in our American system a somewhat fragmented set of regulators. And one thing that was important from the financial sector's perspective is to have one voice here. So one critical piece of work in the area of cybersecurity was to make sure that the regulators were speaking kind of consistently so that the financial sector wasn't getting confused here regarding who's saying what. After we were able to bring together the work of the different agencies within the U.S. federal government, it occurred to us that, hey, this is, cyber threats really don't have borders here. So we needed to move this work internationally, and there was quite a bit of work amongst the G7 countries to build defensiveness in their own financial sectors. And this resulted in a very strong document called The Fundamental Elements of Cybersecurity for the Financial Sectors of the G7. So this was a prominent piece of cybersecurity risk management that was adopted. So cybersecurity, in short, is that is the number one risk that I hear about. I hear about other risks too, and I certainly am hearing quite a bit of focus on the effects of climate. Climate also is something that banks have been raising, certainly in my conversations. But thank you for your question.
Well, thank you very much. My time is about to expire. So Dr. Cook and Dr. Jefferson, I was very impressed in our meetings. I look forward to supporting you, and I will have some questions for the record, which I'll forward to you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate myself with Senator Toomey's comments about the harmful views of Ms. Raskin. I think Senator Toomey asked a very honest, simple question. Do you mean what you say today, or did you mean what you've been saying for years, is really the basic question he's asking. Because it's indeed dangerous to use one's power as a regulator to pick winners and losers, and you've advocated for that, and to discriminate against industries that you find distasteful would be a harmful precedent for the Fed. Ms. Raskin's public comments of politicizing the Fed and using this extraordinary power in ways that would harm millions of Americans is more than just a little concerning. A worker's hard-earned dollars doesn't go as far in today's economy as it used to. This inflation-fueled economy is eroding the spending power of everyday Americans working paycheck to paycheck. The Democrats' tax and spend approach to fiscal policy has driven up prices to a 40-year high since taking office just a little over a year ago. Folks at home in South Carolina keep telling me that they have too much month left at the end of the money. Why is that? Well, gas is almost 50% higher, utilities nearly 25% higher, used cars nearly 40% higher, food, clothes, and shoes higher, higher, higher. Now, I'm concerned that this administration and their chosen regulatory nominees want to make life even more difficult for those hardworking Americans working paycheck to paycheck to bridge these inflation-driven income shortfalls. In 2020, the Federal Reserve Board published a study on the cost of making a small dollar loan. Ms. Bloom-Raskin, are you familiar with that economic research from the Fed?
No, I'm not, but I'd like to learn more.
Yes, ma'am. Well, one of the findings of that research was, and I found it to be particularly alarming, was that the report found that APR rate caps, even at 36%, would effectively eliminate lenders' ability to extend consumer loans under $3,000. I'm not sure if you realize the powerful impact of eliminating loans at $3,000, because that means that those Americans living in marginalized communities like the one I grew up in would have to turn to pawn shops or to a market that doesn't exist, a market that's not regulated, that's not safe, and certainly a market that would not be reliable. That same year, you broadly characterized the spectrum of existing small dollar consumer credit options as a serious threat to low-income communities before endorsing legislation to establish a 36% interest rate cap on all consumer loans. You further justified your support of a federal cap by stating, opposition to such a cap is based either on a misunderstanding of the needs of low-income communities or an out-and-out support of predatory lending. Ms. Raskin, I'm opposed to a national APR rate cap, even at 36%, because it simply eliminates an entire market of small dollar loans for people who need access. And according to the Fed's report, and I hope that you have an opportunity to study that report, it suggests that if you cap it at 36%, you fully eliminate a market for people like the one I was and my mother working as a single parent 16 hours a day, looking for access to loans. Eliminating that market simply means that you lose the opportunity to fix your tire if it blows, or you lose the opportunity to deal with the transmission as we had to back in those days. And so what I'm talking about is a real concern, not a philosophical one, about what we do for Americans who lose access to the market because we decide for them what the market should look like. And I think that's a dangerous place to be. But your characterization that either you are someone who doesn't understand low-income Americans or you are someone who supports the predatory industry. And as that kid, I got to say, I'm not sure which one you would call me. Am I the person who simply doesn't understand the needs and challenges of low-income Americans, or do you put me in the category of someone who's just a cheerleader for predatory lenders?
Okay, thank you for that question. And you are, exactly right. Small dollar loans, I think, are a very important source of credit to all Americans, but particularly those that need access to credit in a timely way. The report that you're talking about, I look forward to looking at it and understanding its methodology and how it came to the conclusions that it did. But you are exactly right, and put your finger on an important challenge, which of course is the availability of safe credit for people when they need it. I think that there's more that can be done in terms of providing access to safe, affordable, small dollar loans. I'm aware that there is work underway to be looking at this, and I think it's an important. I think from that perspective, it's an important issue that you've put your finger on.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm out of time. Let me just simply say this, sir. Thank you for your response, and I will say that we led the efforts to have an interagency framework developed around small dollar lending, and the Fed participated in that process. And I do look forward to your response after seeing the report.
Thanks, sir. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on this conversation, I have made it my mission to try to not figure out how high interest payments low-income borrowers should be able to pay, but actually how do we end the payday lender, the check-cashing place, the pawnbroker as the portal of entry for this universe of Americans into our financial system. Because while we want them to get access to the ability to have such a loan, I don't know why specifically, because of the nature of the status of what their income is, they have to be committed to such high interest rates. It seems to me that we should be putting our collective will and effort together to creating portals of entry for them. Having said that, let me congratulate all the nominations. I'm glad to see the Biden administration is finally taking steps
to bring greater diversity to the leadership of the Fed, but there's a lot more work to be done. Latinos are this country's largest minority. They make up nearly 20% of the United States population, and yet they have no, underline no, representation in Fed leadership. So my question to all of you, if you're confirmed, will you commit to working with my office to increase Latino representation at all levels of the Federal Reserve? A simple yes or no would work.
Yes.
Yes.
If confirmed, you'll have an important role to play in the selection process for presidents and members of the board of directors at the 12 Federal Reserve banks. Would you commit to working to ensure that diverse candidates are considered for these positions? Ms. Raskin.
Yes, I would, Senator. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So, Mr. Raskin, one of the lessons of the 2007 global financial crisis was that excessive incentive-based compensation plans encourage Wall Street executives to take ever greater risks that ultimately pushed our economy into a devastating recession. When we passed Dodd-Frank, one of the provisions I was able to include is that Congress ultimately passed, instructed the financial regulators, including the Fed, to jointly issue rules to rein in these practices. But in the nearly 12 years since Dodd-Frank was enacted, we've seen the CEO to typical pay ratio balloon to over 351 to 1, as well as a number of scandals, including the London Whale, Wells Fargo fake account scandal, Archegos, and all of which seem to be tied to executive pay incentives. What we haven't seen, however, is a strong incentive-based compensation rule finalized by our regulators. So, if confirmed, will you commit to working with the other financial regulator to develop a strong incentive-based compensation rule?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And that was, you're correct, a requirement in the Dodd-Frank Act. It was a requirement with a deadline, and as far as I know, that deadline has happened, and still there is no rule. There is guidance, but there is no rule. And yes, the answer in short is yes, I would work to implement the law.
Thank you. That's a correct observation. It's well past the time that Congress intended. Also, finally, in that regard, would you make it a priority to finalize the rule by the end of this year if you're confirmed?
Well, if confirmed and I were there, I would certainly look into the issue as to the reason for the delay. I believe there are a number of agencies involved in this, so I would certainly commit to look at this issue.
There are, but we need leadership to move the process forward, so I look forward to you having that leadership. Dr. Jefferson, if confirmed, you'll have some difficult decisions to make in the coming months and years with regard to monetary policy. Inflation is running above desired levels, but if we don't critically examine why that is the case, the Fed's response could be counterproductive, maybe could even harm the recovery. Do you agree that the inflation levels we are currently seeing are mainly being driven by supply chain bottlenecks?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I believe that the inflation we're experiencing now has multiple components to it. Certainly the pandemic is a very important impact with regards to the supply side. We know that the supply chain effects cause bottlenecks, and for the given level of demand, supply is not able to meet it. And that puts upward pressure on prices.
And finally, how does the supply side nature of the current inflation inform the Fed's response?
Well, Senator, the tools of monetary policy really can not address these developments that occur on the supply side in terms of resolving them. But the mandate given to the Fed by the Congress is very clear, that the Fed has to be mindful of maximum employment, and equally, it has to be aware of price stability and undertaking policy to preserve price stability. So in this moment, Senator, the inflation rate is high relative to the Fed's target, and so the directive is clear. The Fed must take steps to bring inflation back in line with its targets.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some other questions for the record. I haven't had a chance to meet these nominees, but I look forward to your responses.
Thanks, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jefferson, Dr. Cook, I may not get to ask you many questions today because I want to concentrate on Ms. Raskin's proposal to change the mission of the Federal Reserve. But I've read about both of you. It's clear to me we disagree on some things in terms of our politics, but in America you can believe what you want. That's why it's such a great country. Dr. Jefferson, I believe you're at Davidson. You're a professor there? Yeah, there's no better place in America to get a liberal arts education. Dr. Cook, you are a Truman Scholar? And you were a Marshall Scholar. You were at St. Hilda's? Yes. Okay. You ever met a Marshall Scholar that was a dummy?
No, Senator.
Me neither. The only advice for what it was worth, for what it's worth that I have for each of you is, number one, please don't change the mission of the Federal Reserve. Please don't let it be politicized. And number two, don't get caught up in the group think over there. Okay? Only dead fish go with the flow. Don't get caught up in the group think. Now, Ms. Raskin, May of 2020, the world economy is melting down because government shut it down. We're trying to hold it together with baling wire, duct tape, spit, and happy thoughts. And you say, that's great, but we ought to let oil and gas companies go broke. Did you really mean that?
Well, thank you, Senator Kennedy.
You're welcome.
For that question. And the Federal Reserve has particular mandates set out by law.
But I know about all that, but did you mean it? You said it, here it is, big as Dallas. I read the op-ed. You said, save everybody but the oil and gas industry and let them go broke. Did you really mean that?
So I have been clear on my views. The whole point of the op-ed was that the Fed should not pick winners and losers.
Except for oil and gas. You said they ought to be allowed to go broke.
The Fed should not pick or favor any sector at all.
Then why did you say it?
The Fed is not in the business of choosing winners and losers.
Then why did you recommend to them that they let oil and gas go broke?
I did not recommend.
Yes, ma'am. I read the op-ed. There it is. It's. I'm not going to quote it to you, but Senator Toomey pointed out. Why did you mean it?
Senator Kennedy, I want you to understand the role of the proper role of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve should not be choosing winners and losers.
Yes, ma'am. So you disagree with the editorial?
The editorial was one that I wrote, and I wrote it in the context of the Federal Reserve's emergency lending facilities. This was a special program set up by the CARES Act, by the Congress, that appropriated taxpayer money. This was an issue quite unlike the issue of supervision
and you said don't give the money to oil and gas. Let them go broke, because in my opinion, they're bad for the environment. Didn't you?
I want you to understand the context for that article. That article had to do with did not have to do with supervision and regulation.
Dr. Raskin, you said it. You ought to own it. Okay, you ought to own it.
Sorry?
You said it. You ought to own what you said. I'd respect you more if you did. Let me let me move on to this business of allocating capital. Now, look, this is America. You can believe what you want, and I mean that. But I don't agree with your mission to politicize the Federal Reserve.
I don't believe the Federal Reserve should be politicized either.
Well, then why did you say it? Why did you say in this June 2020 piece, quote, federal regulatory bodies should allocate capital?
It is not the role of the Federal Reserve in supervisory or regulatory matters in its functioning as...
Then why did you write it?
It was written in a context, Senator, that had to do with emergency lending. It did not have to do with the context of supervision and regulation.
I feel strongly about charter schools, okay? If some president or some chairman of the Federal Reserve said, let's all get together and allocate capital away, lean on all the banks so they don't fund charter schools. You support that? I mean, you support driving oil and gas industry into bankruptcy. Do you think that would be the proper role for the Federal Reserve?
No, obviously not. The Federal Reserve is not to get involved in allocating credit to any particular sector.
So you changed your mind?
I have made myself completely clear. The whole point of the op-ed was that the Fed should not pick winners and losers or expose taxpayers to undue risk.
Senator Kennedy, your time's expired.
Well, no, you went 3 minutes over.
I did, and so did Senator Toomey, but we need this hearing done by 11 o'clock.
Well, can I ask one more?
No, you've already gone 2 minutes over. Senator Warner, you're recognized, Senator from Virginia.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say to my friend from Louisiana, I think your appropriate admonition about only dead fish go with the flow, maybe that could be applied to both sides on our partisan basis too, as senators.
Well, I agree with that. I don't even know what parties they're in.
I understand. I appreciate that. Ms. Raskin, it's good to see you. I do want to note, we all know you've got progressive views, but I've been actually very surprised and pleasantly surprised by the number of Virginia bankers who had experience with you and believe very much that you were a very fair and balanced regulator. And I hope that is reflected in the record as well. And former heads of the independent community bankers and others have come forward on supporting you. And again, I think that bodes well for you. I also a little surprised. My understanding of the Fed's role and responsibility is also to look at systemic risk. And I tell you, in my state, whether we call it Hampton Roads, our tidal regions, Norfolk, Virginia Beach, others, they have huge risk to those economies because of sea level rise. Now, we don't call it climate change because that may not be the politically appropriate terminology, but I sure as heck know the banks, the financial institutions, political leadership, Democrat and Republican on both sides in Hampton Roads, views sea level rise as a incredibly significant systemic risk. And I believe it would be, that risk is amplified around. I think my friend, the colleague from Louisiana, they have that same challenges around New Orleans and elsewhere. So I do think as we think about both the questions of full employment, systemic risk, these issues are extraordinarily relevant. I also have to tell you that one of the things I was hoping to raise with you, Senator Reid raised, and you kind of took the answer and ran with it, and that was cyber. Because I find when I talk to bankers, when I sit in my role as Intelligence Committee Chair, cyber is an omnipresent risk, and we should all be alert now. God willing, we're not going to see military action coming out of Russia with Ukraine, but should there be a component part of that will be cyber. And as we saw from the Russian attack against Ukraine in NotPetya, you can't limit a cyber attack to a geographic area. There were literally tens of billions of dollars of losses in America due to the NotPetya attack in 2015. So So my hope would be that cyber will continue to be a focus, and you've addressed it pretty well, but I want to know if there was anything else. You've had experience in cyber. Was there anything else? You had a pretty comprehensive answer. And I do want to get one other question in for you and Ms. Cook, if possible, but I want to give you another chance to
Yes,
weigh
no,
in on something.
I appreciate your underscoring what certainly has been my experience in talking to the financial sector regarding cybersecurity. The threats are actually evolving at a very quick pace. This is a type of warfare, as you might imagine, and the defensiveness of the financial sector, I think, is really at stake here. There's obviously, it's not the role of the Fed, certainly, to stop cyber attacks, but I do think it's important from a supervisory and risk perspective to make sure that the financial sector feels that it has the defensiveness.
Wouldn't a massive cyber attack that could potentially bring down part of our financial system, while there's reporting requirements in the financial system, there's not for the balance of the economy? We've got a bipartisan bill that was going to get into the defense authorization that would at least require some level of mandatory reporting, but a catastrophic cyber attack against our financial sector, wouldn't that be a systemic risk?
Yes, I think it could.
I agree with you. Let me move quickly, because I want to make, again, I want to honor the chairman's request to get all questions in, and I'd like you to address, and I know Dr. Jefferson and I talked a little bit about this, but I'd like to get at least you and Dr. Cook on this, and I'll come back to Dr. Jefferson in subsequent questions. CDFIs, MDIs, critically important role. I think you've both played, have experience with them. How do we make sure that the Fed can do more to shore up that critical component of our financial sector? Because clearly lending to low and moderate income individuals has got to be a role if we're going to, again, have both financial stability, economic stability, and close to full employment. Either one of you, please. Dr. Cook, do you want to take that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I sit on the board of SCDFI, and I've learned a lot about it. And I think the Federal Reserve is beginning to engage in discussions about CRA reform. And I think part of that is shoring up the funding for CDFIs. They're critical in terms of getting funding to where capital doesn't go, whether we're talking about urban areas or rural areas. But certainly this is important for entrepreneurship, for the dual mandate, the carrying out of the dual mandate, especially maximum employment. So thank you for your support of CDFI, Senator.
And I think huge opportunities with CRA reform. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warner. Senator Haggerty of Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to direct my first questions to each of the nominees, and congratulations to you on your nomination. First, I'd like to ask each of you, have you currently or have you ever embellished any part of your resume, your background, or your publications? I'll start with you, Dr. Jefferson.
No, Senator.
Ms. Bloom-Raskin.
No, sir.
Dr. Cook.
No, sir.
Well, Dr. Cook, whether intentional or unintentional, it appears that you made a number of omissions in the paperwork that you submitted to this committee, and you've made several mischaracterizations of your background. But even more concerning to me, with respect to your nomination, is that your background, although very impressive as you covered with Senator Kennedy, doesn't seem related to the mission of the Federal Reserve. If I look at your list of publications and your speeches, it seems more like social science than it does economics and monetary policy. Could you describe for me in more detail what your economic specialty is?
Senator, thank you so much for that question. I certainly am proud of my academic background. I know that I have been the target of anonymous and untrue attacks on my academic record. But I'd like to tell you about my academic record. And that is relevant. I have a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. I specialized in macroeconomics and international economics.
I'm aware of that. I would like to get to that in the questions for the record.
Sure.
There are a number of issues about claiming that articles were peer-reviewed when they were not, the characterization of your academic affiliations, but we'll get to that in the questions for the record. My question for you now is if you would underscore what your academic specialty is and how it's related to monetary policy.
Sure. I'd answer that in several ways. First, I specialize in managing financial crises, and I've done that in several instances. At the Treasury Department, I was at the Financial Crisis Think Tank and worked closely with John Taylor, with Secretary Summers, and others in managing financial crises. At CEA, I was a person who was in charge of managing the Eurozone crisis at CEA, and I worked collaboratively with NSC to do that. So I have publications that are related to banking reform and recognizing systemic risk. So I take the research that I do and I turn it into something in the field. And that's what I do at a land-grant institution.
Thank you. Well, monetary policy is a very blunt and a very potent tool. And I would have expected someone with deeper experience in the monetary policy realm. But I appreciate your being here and thank you for your answer. Ms. Raskin, I'd like to turn to you. I want to talk to you about the actions last December that took place at the FDIC. There, CFPB Director Rohit Chopra and Interim Director Martin Grunberg took actions to basically eviscerate the chairman's role there at the FDIC before her term expired, and it was deeply troubling to me and a number of members of this committee. It broke historical precedent. It was a remarkable undermining of the independence and the integrity of our financial regulators, and I want to ensure that a situation like this does not happen at the Fed. In her nomination hearing in front of this committee, Governor Brainerd committed to deferring to the Fed chairman to set the agenda at the Federal Reserve Board. So, Ms. Raskin, if you're confirmed, do you commit to doing the same?
Yes, I do, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you. The last thing I want to see is another coup d'etat like we saw at the FDIC, and this committee is here to backstop and ensure that that doesn't happen. Ms. Raskin, another question for you. Are higher gas prices good or bad for America? Get your button there.
Thank you, Senator. I have to say, higher gas prices really do hit. In my neighborhood, they're up to $3.33 a gallon. You go into a gas station now to fill your tank, and you say, should I actually really fill it? I mean, maybe you.
We're running tight on time. Is that good or is it bad for America?
Well, it certainly hurts your pocketbook.
Well, it absolutely does that. And I'm very concerned, given the level of inflation that we're experiencing right now and the Fed's role with respect to inflation, the policies that you've supported. As my colleague, Senator Kennedy, discussed with you, I'm very concerned about weaponizing the Fed and using it to attack industries like the oil and gas industry, particularly right now when we see energy prices through the roof. This sort of move would not only make inflation worse in America when it's already running rampant, but it would also make us more dependent on other nations for them to supply oil and gas to us because you want to choke off oil and gas here in America and make us less secure as a nation. So it's very concerning to me, and again, I realize we're out of time, but I would like to underscore the fact that I think it is highly inappropriate, again, to weaponize the regulatory construct of the Federal Reserve in any manner that might be pursuing issues outside the mandate of price stability and full employment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada is recognized.
Thank you. Let me ask right out of the bat. Thank you, first of all three of you, for the opportunity to meet with you and have a conversation with you. But let me ask you this. The board that you are looking to be nominated to, there's 7 members. Can any single one member weaponize the mission of the board? Yes or no? I'll start with Ms. Raskin.
No.
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 Thank you. That makes me feel much better. Dr. Cook, you have held many high-profile leadership posts. Let me ask you about your previous leadership positions with other regional Federal Reserve banks. I know you serve on the Advisory Council for the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, led by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and you also are a board member for the Federal Home Loan Bank of Indianapolis. How have these positions prepared you to serve on the Federal Reserve Bank?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I have come to know the needs and opportunities associated with rural communities through my service through the Federal Home Loan Bank of Indianapolis. Certainly, community banks are struggling. There's been a secular decline in them over the last 30 years, but they provide absolutely critical capital to small communities and places where capital doesn't show up. My membership on the board of directors of CDFI, same thing. CDFIs provide capital, they're pillars of their communities where capital doesn't typically flow. And what we know about the United States is that entrepreneurship is a tried and true path to the middle class. And both those institutions, whether through affordable housing, through the Federal Home Loan Bank of Indianapolis, or through supporting entrepreneurs, would help to support this American dream of entrepreneurship. So I've been grateful for those opportunities, and they would inform, if confirmed, my deliberations on the Federal Reserve.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I also really appreciate the opportunity that I see before me. I think the diversity is important for this particular board because it is important that the members really mirror and represent the rest of the country. How are we going to understand the needs of so many individuals across the country if we don't have that representation at all levels? So I appreciate all of you appearing before me today. Let me ask you, Ms. Raskin, we worked so hard during this last pandemic to appropriate the CARES bill, the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and they provided important relief to families while also looking to do long-term investments in health and housing and infrastructure. I also know, coming from Nevada, that the last financial crisis, it took us 7 years to come out of that financial crisis. So my question for you is, what were the lessons that we learned from that last financial crisis, and how did they help us as we looked to this financial crisis to avoid that extensive economic pain for Americans during this pandemic? If you would reflect on that.
Yes, thank you for that really interesting question, Senator. And I think the lessons are still to be learned because we're not, we haven't completely emerged certainly from the effects of the pandemic. But I think you're right to point to differences in approaches that certainly both from the perspective of monetary policy and fiscal policy that were taken, and the extent to which those, that different mix of policies had an effect. I mean, in one dimension, I think what we saw was that the financial sector actually did quite fine, seems to have done quite fine during what was a massive blow that came from the pandemic. That was good to see, and suggests certainly something about the resilience that the financial sector had going in, and the mix of policies that were available to respond. So I think this is an evolving question, but it's one we should always, as policymakers, and if I were confirmed, I would urge us to always be trying to think back. I mean, it's pretty amazing that for many of us now there have been 2 crises in our lifetimes. I mean, so there are things to learn, and I think that trying to understand those learnings will certainly help as we continue to build economic resiliency going forward.
Thank you. I know I've gone over my time, Dr. Jefferson. Thank you again for meeting with me. I will submit the remainder of my questions for the record. Congratulations to all 3 of you.
Thank you. Senator Lummis of Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, nominees. My questions are for Ms. Raskin. I'd like to ask you about Federal Reserve master account access. This is an issue of great interest to Wyoming and my constituents. I asked Chairman Powell about it. I asked Governor Brainerd about it at their nomination hearings. I've been stonewalled at the Fed, and so I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Master accounts are the way banks access the payment system. Many non-banks, including trust companies, have applied and failed to receive a Fed master account. To my knowledge, there's one, and only one, state chartered trust company that has a Fed master account. It's a startup based in Colorado, formed in 2016, called Reserve Trust. Reserve Trust has repeatedly touted the value of the company's Fed master account. Their homepage says, in 2021, one of the company's investors underscored that Reserve Trust is armed with a master account at the Federal Reserve and direct access to the payment rails. The only company in the country that has that, the only fintech company. Now, a Fed master account gives Reserve Trust an enormous advantage over everybody else, since it appears they're the only one who has it. And you're very familiar with Reserve Trust because you joined their board in May 2017, just 4 months after leaving Treasury, right? Right?
Well, thank you for your question. I joined the board of Reserve Trust in 2017.
And your
I
Treasury
served on it.
stint came after 4 years as a Federal Reserve governor, right?
4 years. I think after I left as a Federal Reserve governor, I went to Treasury as Deputy Secretary of Treasury.
You went from the Federal Reserve governor to Treasury and then to Reserve Trust's board. And then Reserve Trust had its master account application denied in June 2017. But 1 year later, the Fed granted it a master account in 2018. It's a mystery to me how dozens of fintech companies have tried unsuccessfully and how Wyoming's SPDI charter has been under review for well over a year, 2.5 years at the Fed consulting with them about how to make this qualify. How did Reserve Trust get there so quickly? After Reserve Trust had their application denied, did you communicate with the Federal Reserve about Reserve Trust's application?
So, Senator, I was on the board of Reserve Trust, on the board of directors from 2017 till 2019.
And they got their master account in 2018. So did you call or communicate with the Federal Reserve about Reserve Trust's application?
Well, certainly, if you are suggesting anything improper, I want to make very clear that I have, first of all, had the honor to serve in various public capacities, and each time I left, I have been very mindful of the rules regarding departure.
Well, it's my understanding you did call the Kansas City Fed in August of 2017 regarding Reserve Trust's master account application. So I have significant questions about your involvement in Reserve Trust efforts to obtain a master account. So Reserve Trust is denied, you go on their board, then they get a master account. Did you communicate with the Board of Governors about Reserve Trust's application?
So I can assure you that I have been very focused.
Well, who did you communicate with?
First of all, I want to be very clear here. The Federal Reserve has approved plenty of master accounts for non-bank.
But not in fintech. You resigned from Reserve Trust in August of 2019, correct?
August 2019, I left the board of Reserve Trust.
Correct. Now, do you know Amias Garrity?
Yes, I do know Amias Garrity.
Okay, so while you were number 2 at Treasury, Mr. Garrity was the acting assistant secretary for financial institutions, and he reported to you, right?
He did not report directly to me, but yes, he was at Treasury when I was there.
And he's also a partner at QED Investor, which is now the controlling owner of Reserve Trust. So in 2020, QED Investor purchased the 195,000 Reserve Trust shares you received when you joined the board in 2017. And they purchased your shares for almost $1.5 million. Even in this town, that's a lot of money for being on a company's board of directors for 2 years. So let me recap. You leave Treasury, you serve on the board of Reserve Trust for 2 years. Their first application for a master account is denied, but after the denial, you call the Federal Reserve. And Reserve Trust receives a Fed master account, the only state chartered trust company in the country to get one. And you walk away with $1.5 million. Something doesn't smell right with the way this played out. My state's companies, my constituents, have been stonewalled, have been slow-walked, and have not been able to get approval, even though they've been working with the Fed for 2.5 years on our very specific guidelines for getting master accounts. Now, Mr. Chairman, I don't know the details here because the Fed hasn't provided us with any documents we've asked about Reserve Trust master accounts. But I think this requires additional scrutiny by the committee, and I look forward to receiving it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Senator Warnock from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairman Brown.
Is this on? All right, is it on? There we go. Thank you, Chairman Brown, and congratulations to Ms. Raskin, Dr. Cook, and Dr. Jefferson for your nominations to leadership at the Federal Reserve Board. Congratulations to all of you. But I would like to take a moment to especially congratulate Georgia's own Dr. Cook. As a child, Dr. Cook was one of the first black children to integrate her public school and has since spent a lifetime breaking racial and gender barriers. Since graduating from Spelman College, an HBCU I know a little bit about across the street from my Morehouse College, located in the heart of Atlanta, Dr. Lisa Cook, you've committed decades of your life to pushing the field of economics forward and sharing your knowledge with the world. And based on your clear qualifications and readily apparent expertise, it is clear that your nomination to the Federal Reserve Board will continue our important work to have an economy that works for all Americans. And we cannot ignore that your historic nomination to the Federal Reserve Board will serve as an inspiration for generations of young black women who would like to study economics and dedicate themselves to work in the highest levels of public service. We're to have an economy that works for all Americans. The Federal Reserve Board needs to look more like all Americans. And so I'm proud of your nomination, and Georgia is proud of your nomination, and I look forward to voting for you both in this committee and on the Senate floor for your confirmation. Now, Georgians are feeling the rise and the crunch of rising costs on their everyday lives, and as Chairman Powell said before this committee during his own nomination hearing a few weeks ago, some companies may be raising prices simply because they can. We're seeing this in corporate earnings. Follow the money. The evidence is there. These costs are being borne most acutely by everyday Georgians and small businesses, having an adverse impact on our economy. For example, the average price of a gallon of gas in Georgia has gone up by 4% in just the past month. In Brunswick, that increase is almost 6%. down in Old Brunswick, Georgia, all while profits among the largest oil and gas companies soar. So they're doing more than passing on the costs. So, Dr. Jefferson, when considering systemic risks to our economy, such as inflation and increasing costs, what considerations do you give to corporations and wealthy executives choosing profits over the stability of our economy?
Thank you, Senator, very much for your question. And the concern that American families have with inflation is real because they feel it in their pocketbooks. It impacts what they are able to do from a week-to-week basis. It impacts their outlook for the future. And so what the Fed can do is think about the full menu of prices that American families have to contend with and conduct monetary policy in such a way that, on average, those prices are consistent with its target. With respect to the issues of concentration that you are indicating, there are other regulatory bodies that are more geared and prepared and skilled at looking at the concentration of industry. What the Congress has mandated that the Fed do is think about inflation overall. And if I were confirmed, I would keep the Fed's focus on that and trust that other agencies of the regulatory structure would look closely at issues of concentration.
So what kinds of tools might you use to address this issue?
Well, Senator, the tools that are the Feds would not be able to meet the issues of industry concentration. That on the that side of the economy, that is not something that Federal Reserve instruments. I'm thinking about concentration outside of the financial sector. That is not something that Fed policy can address directly.
Well, it's something I'm very concerned about, and it's why I asked the White House Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force to investigate these practices by international cargo carriers, for example, down in the port of Savannah, where we were dealing with this issue, and we were able to loosen $8 million to help with the congestion there, but we're seeing these rising prices. Dr. Cook, how would you respond to these issues?
Thank you for that question, because I've seen those gas prices going up as I was vacationing in Georgia with my family over the holidays. I think that this issue, as Dr. Jefferson was saying, is largely outside the purview of the Federal Reserve. However, I think that it deserves more study, and we have, especially if there is any threat to financial stability, for example, or relates to the Fed's supervisory role, that would deserve more study. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Raskin?
Thank you. Oh, Senator Warnock,
I'm out of time.
Your time has expired. If you would do it, because members want to go to the 11 o'clock briefing.
Absolutely.
Senator Kramer from North Dakota is remote from North Dakota, I believe. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for accommodating this format. And thanks to all of our witnesses, and congratulations to all of you on being nominated. I've been watching attentively and taking some notes, and I want to explore a little deeper, Ms. Boom-Raskin, some of the context. Your exchange with Senator Kennedy, where you were trying to explain the context of your editorial, your op-ed, relating to risk and in the oil and gas industry in particular, the fossil fuel industry in particular. I went back and read that same piece after that exchange to familiarize myself both with the content and the context. And you're right in that you were writing in response to the expansion of the Main Street Lending Program that we worked hard to get because oil and gas industry, huge jobs industry, and huge national security industry in our country was being sort of set aside, ignored, if you will, by the Main Street Lending Program. And yet we were building bridges for all kinds of other industries, none any more important, certainly, than the oil and gas industry. So you're right that was the context in which you wrote your piece. But as I read the piece, you did not confine your advice or your opinions to simply the Main Street Lending Program. There was no strategic ambiguity whatsoever in your statements. And I am very concerned going forward, not just because there's a single nominee that shares these views that you share so vehemently and so rigorously, but rather that there have been lots of them and lots of areas, lots of agencies, and more than one or two with the Federal Reserve, various positions in the Federal Reserve. I'm very concerned about that. I've appreciated your reiterating the script that the Fed's job is not to pick winners and losers, not pick winners and losers. But once you're in a regulatory role, it's not just the regulations that matter, but it's as much as anything the regulator themselves. So I have great concern about your position and the increased power that you want to give to the Federal Reserve as it relates to allocating capital away from legal commerce. You used an interesting word in describing the parameters as you see them. You used the word resiliency, and that's an important word. It means something very important, but it also means a lot to our economy as it relates to energy. And so I want to just sort of flip the script a little bit on you and ask if you think that it is a risk that banks ought to consider if market that they support has a less than reliable or resilient supply of energy. If you're Texas or other parts of the South or the Southwest, Midwest that has failed resiliency tests in recent times, or the Northeast or California, where they've gone away from base load electricity, for example, and replaced it with more intermittent forms of electricity, that people actually die when that electricity doesn't work during cold times, or that manufacturing has to be curtailed during certain times because they're very energy dependent. Is that a risk that you think the banks ought to consider and that the Fed ought to keep an eye on?
So thank you, and thank you for for attempting here to understand context. And I do want to underscore that the Federal Reserve, as far as I know, is not looking to expand its powers. The Federal Reserve has mandates, very clear mandates that that Congress has provided, and the Federal Reserve, I hope, and certainly if I were confirmed, needs to always act within those parameters. It is absolutely critical to independence. It is critical because it's the law, and it's necessary to not get into positions of regulatory overreach or regulatory matters that are way beyond the purview. And what is way beyond the purview? Well, one thing that's way beyond the purview is that it is bankers who are making the decision about who to lend to. That is not a Fed decision, and it never should be. I don't have any evidence to suggest that it is or that it would be, but it is not a regulator and supervisory function for a regulator to take over the basic business decision that the bank is making. And why is that? Because banks exist, first of all, they're private entities, right? And they are in the best position to know what kind of loans should be made. They are in the best position to know what kinds of terms need to be structured around any kind of credit extension. That is their expertise, and that is an expertise that I would argue needs to be maintained. So I certainly appreciate the fact and the cardinal principle that the Federal Reserve does not exist to be favoring any particular sectors, and the regulatory approach should not be in any way choosing certain sectors over others.
Thank you. Previous rhetoric match that. I know I'm well over, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for indulging me. I'll provide some more comments.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Tester of Montana is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Toomey. I appreciate it. And Governor Bloom-Raskin and Drs. Cook, Dr. Jefferson, thank you for being here. Look, I think it's critically important that the Fed gets all the information that they can when they're dealing with risk to our financial system. And I think that it is rather obvious that climate change has to be part of the information that you gather. And why I say that is because I've been 44 years plus on our farm. I've been in a family for over 110 years, and things have changed. And the proof of that is that I believe it was in 2020, 40% of the farmers' income came from the federal government because consolidation in the industry and climate change. Last year we spent $140 billion of hard-earned taxpayer dollars on climate change issues. Banks are important. As somebody involved in agriculture, we need to have access to dollars. That's where it's at, is in the banks. We don't want these banks to go under, and I know that there are many on this committee that says, give me one example. I can tell you one of the reasons they haven't gone under is because we put out $140 billion last year and we've got crop insurance. Without that, those banks would be in serious trouble. But the truth is this. There's been a lot of discussion around what the Fed should be doing or shouldn't be doing. This is a question for you, Governor Raskin. In your role, the Federal Reserve or any other federal or financial regulator, in your opinion, do you believe that we should be discouraging banks, or you should be discouraging banks in the Federal Reserve or any other federal regulator from lending to carbon-based fuels like coal, oil, or gas?
No, I do not.
Drs. Cook and Jefferson, do you agree with that opinion?
I agree.
I agree.
Okay. When Chairman Powell and Governor Brainerd were before this committee, I asked them about the Fed's independence, as I did each one of you when we met on Zoom a few days ago. I think it is absolutely critically important that the Fed remains independent. I saw former President Trump try to influence the Fed and takes actions for his own political gain, not for the well-being of this economy. And I am grateful that Chairman Powell, and it's one of the reasons I supported him in the position as chair, and the board's commitment to maintain that Fed independence under intense pressure. And I might add, political pressure from the right or the left is inappropriate on the Fed. So I want to know why, because you guys answered this question correct, and I thank you. You believe the Fed should be independent. Could you tell me why it would be a mistake to allow politics to influence our nation's monetary policy? And be as brief as you can. I'll start with you, Governor Raskin.
Well, thank you, Senator Tester. The Fed's independence is absolutely sacrosanct. You're exactly right that it can't be compromised in any way from political forces on any side. The supervision and regulation of the Fed, as well as the conduct of monetary policy, has to be beyond reproach. And that is critical to our functioning as an economy and as a society. So I can't state more emphatically the importance of independence.
Dr. Cook?
Senator, I've advised in a number of emerging markets and developing countries where the central bank was not independent. And every day, citizens of those countries suffered tremendously as a result, typically with respect to hyperinflation or at least high inflation environments. And I would say that I would be committed to Federal Reserve independence, and I would make sure that everyday Americans didn't suffer what I saw abroad.
Dr. Jefferson.
Senator, one of the assets on the Fed's balance sheet is the trust of the American people. And that has built up over time because of the Fed's adherence to the mandates given to it by the Congress. So that cornerstone of independence underlies all that the Fed could hope to achieve for the well-being of the American people.
Thank you all for your testimony. Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Tester. Senator Moran of Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you to our nominees for being with us today. I congratulate you on the position you're in today. I've been very interested in the responses I've heard both on television and in the committee room to Senator Tester, to Senator Kramer in particular. I come here troubled. You seem to all say, particularly you, Ms. Raskin, the thing I want to hear. I want a Federal Reserve that is not going to pick winners and losers. You commit to that. You indicated in response to the question that you should not be regulating in a way that discourages banks from making independent decisions about whether or not they should loan to energy and oil and gas companies. That's a right answer from my perspective. What troubles me is that we all, in our politics, in our views, we want a result, and we seem less interested in the process by which we get that result. The Federal Reserve is not the entity to make the decision about whether this country moves forward or in a different direction with oil and gas, with energy production. That's perhaps, it's certainly the free market system, but it's perhaps Congress with a president. It's not an executive order. It's not a decision by the Federal Reserve. The decisions we make here, in too many instances, Republicans will set aside the process to get the result. The Democrats set aside the process to get the result, and it's not always about the result because the process is what makes us a free nation. So I need greater assurance than what you're attempting to give me that you will not use the Fed to diminish the role of the energy sector or any other private sector. I don't look at this any differently than if you came here to tell me you were going to use the Fed to promote an industry. You are neutral in what is a legal business in this country. And in my view, you have no opportunity, none, to try to discourage the oil and gas industry from existing or prospering, just like you have no authority to decide that, well, we want solar energy or wind energy and we're going to promote it by regulations of our financial institutions. I'm troubled by what Chairman Powell said in response to the chairman in his questioning, that the chairman is going to defer to you, Ms. Raskin, on this topic. And you said, in response to the question of Senator from Nevada, you responded that it takes all of you to make a decision. No one can do it. And so I'm troubled by any of the nominees who have the belief that there is a path by which you can regulate a legally authorized existing business. That's an issue for the political process. And we talk about transition. You all talk about transition. The transition is societal shifts. It's gambles. It's predictions. It's not economics for the Fed to be engaged in trying to figure out the societal changes of our nation. What am I missing?
Well, thank you. I mean, the record for me is the record that I have had as a bank commissioner in the state of Maryland, already as a Fed governor, and as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. And I can't state more emphatically than I already have that it is not the role of the Federal Reserve to get engaged in favoring one sector.
So, Ms. Raskin, what opportunity do you, if it's not the role,
yeah,
then are you saying you can't do it and won't do it?
I'm saying it actually, I view it as outside the bounds of the law. The Federal Reserve was set up by Congress and with particular mandates. And as as a lawyer, I live within those mandates.
So let me ask you as a lawyer, is there a path that you see in any fashion in which, if it is your view that the oil and gas industry, fossil fuels, need to be diminished in the role of this nation in our economy, is there any path for you to accomplish that as a member of the Federal Reserve?
I certainly have not explored that and would imagine there is no such path.
I wish you could say that more firmly, that there is not a path and one that there is nothing you can pursue.
Do you have an idea for me? I mean, I'm not sure I see any attempt in any supervisory context or within the existing mandates of the Federal Reserve that have been set up by Congress to do anything that would favor a specific industry. That is not how regulation and supervision is done.
You're telling me I have nothing to worry about?
Unless you, I'd be curious as to whether you're thinking of something in particular, but I certainly don't see.
No trick question. Just wanting to know if you have any plan, any path, any desire.
Zero. None.
And if you had the desire, you can't accomplish it.
Correct. I have no desire, and if I had the desire, I couldn't accomplish it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Moran. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to all three of our nominees. It's good to see you here today. So let's jump right in on climate change, and let's focus on the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who is supported by many of the Republicans who have spoken out today and who are so alarmed about the conversations about climate. I'd like to read a series of statements by Fed Chair Powell, who has been renominated by President Biden to serve another term as chair. In response to a question I asked during his confirmation hearing last month, Chair Powell said, and I quote, "Our role," meaning the Fed's role, "on climate change is a limited one, but an important one. And it is to assure that the banking institutions that we regulate understand their risks and can manage them. It is also to look after financial stability. And with financial stability, the issue really is, can something from climate change arise to the level that would threaten the stability of the entire financial system?" End quote. So I just want to go down the line here. This should be an easy question. Does Chair Powell's statement on the Fed's responsibility for ensuring that banks are managing their climate risks and addressing climate risk threats to the financial stability correctly describe your views as well? Professor Bloom-Raskin, let's start with you.
Yes, that statement sounds correct to me.
Thank you. Dr. Cook?
Yes.
Dr. Jefferson?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. So we have four people, the chairman of the Federal Reserve and these three nominees who are aligned on the role of the Fed in dealing with climate change. Now, when my colleague Senator Ossoff asked Chair Powell last year whether climate change had implications for the Fed's dual mandate and its responsibility for financial stability, Chair Powell said, and I want to quote here, "I think it has implications for all of those things," close quote, because, quote, "we know that the transition to a lower carbon economy may lead to a sudden repricing of assets or entire industries, and we need to think about that carefully in advance and be in a position to deal with all of that," end quote. Professor Bloom-Raskin, starting with you, does this statement by Chair Powell also describe your views?
Yes, it does.
And Dr. Cook?
Yes, it does, Senator.
And Dr. Jefferson?
Yes.
Okay. And when Chairman Brown asked Chair Powell about what the Fed would do to address the risks from climate change, Chair Powell said, and I want to quote, that climate stress scenarios will be a key tool going forward. Does everyone agree? Professor Bloom-Raskin?
Yes.
Dr. Cook?
Yes.
Dr. Jefferson?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to do one more. These climate stress scenarios that the Fed are planning are, in Powell's words, quote, about assuring that the large financial institutions understand all the risks they are taking, including the risks that may be inherent in their business model regarding climate change over time. Once again, going down the line, do you agree, Professor Bloom-Raskin?
Yes.
Dr. Cook?
Yes.
Dr. Jefferson?
Yes.
Look, thank you. I don't support Chair Powell's nomination for another term running the Fed, but even he thinks that it is just common sense that the Fed should work to mitigate the risk of significant economic loss triggered by climate change. Central bankers around the world agree with him. Heck, this position is so non-controversial that the previous vice chair for supervision, Randy Quarles, who was appointed by President Trump and never met a rule he didn't want to weaken, requested the Fed's membership in the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is an international coalition of financial institutions that's working to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we really have to ask, what's going on here? Why are the Republicans so stirred up by a mainstream position? Why is it okay when Jerome Powell says that climate issues are part of the Fed's mandate, but it's not okay when Professor Bloom Raskin and other nominees say the same thing? Why is the Chamber of Commerce funding a multi-million-dollar campaign to kill any action by policymakers to address the climate crisis, and who is really footing the bill here? Perhaps the real problem here is that Professor Bloom Raskin isn't willing to let big oil stand in the way of the Fed doing its job. The fossil fuel industry and their lobbyists and friends in Congress may not like that, but asking the Fed to ignore climate risk is to ask the Fed to defy its congressional mandate. An institution responsible for the security of our financial system and the growth of our economy cannot blind itself to climate issues. We're in a climate crisis, and we need regulators with backbone. I just want to mention one other thing before I quit here. I have long advocated for rewriting our ethics rules to prevent conflicts of interest, to close the revolving door, and to restore Americans' trust in our political system. I believe that we must examine a nominee's total balance of qualifications, but I've asked nominees from both the Republican and Democratic administrations to abide by higher ethical standards. I'm discussing these standards with every Fed nominee, and I look forward to their responses, including from those who are not at the hearing today. So again, congratulations to our nominees. I look forward to your confirmation. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks,
Chair.
Senator Warren. Senator Tillis from his office is recognized from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to all the nominees before us today. You know, if you're confirmed, you're going to have a vote on how banks are supervised and regulated. As part of your job goes outside of the view of the public, sometimes by necessity, but some of it needs to be transparent. In one case, the Fed has issued or used an asset cap to restrict growth of a bank and its ability to compete. So I want to ask this of each of the nominees. In the instance the asset cap has been used, it's been for a number of years now, since the financial crisis. And it was a drastic penalty that I believe we now need to question whether or not it should be in place, or we should provide clarity or a roadmap for growth going forward. So maybe starting with Mr. Jefferson and then Ms. Cook and then Ms. Raskin, I've got 3 questions for you. Number one, what are the conditions that you think would be reasonable to lift the asset cap? Another one is, when will it be used again? And the third one is, does a bank need to be perfect to get it lifted?
Senator, thank you very much for your question. It sounds like it's very specific and in an area where I do not have expertise. And so what I would like to say in response to your specific questions is that if I were confirmed, I would look forward to learning more about this particular set of issues, and I would welcome the opportunity to invest my time to work with you and your staff
Okay.
to become better educated about it.
Just first off, I should have thanked you for the time that we spent on the phone. I enjoyed the conversation, and you and I don't live too far apart down in North Carolina. But we did talk about the need for a healthy ecosystem, and I think that these caps at the top end of the ecosystem over time could be damaging to the overall health and hygiene of the entire ecosystem, which includes small banks. Ms. Cook.
Thank you for your question, Senator. The way I would look at it would be to assess the risk to the system and make sure that the financial system remains resilient. That's within the purview of the Federal Reserve's role in bank supervision.
So would you, with that response, I've got limited time. I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't like doing that. But does that mean that that we could look at rules of the road and get rid of this arbitrary cap, and that's something that you'd be open to discussing?
It is something that, because I, like Professor Jefferson, I am not as familiar with this particular issue, I would look forward to studying it with an open mind and having deliberations with my colleagues, if confirmed, with an open mind.
Thank you. Ms. Raskin.
So, Senator Tillis, you point to a very important feature of regulation, which is clarity. And I think that if there is ways to improve a regulation by making it more clear, I think that is a huge plus. It's a huge service. And yes, I would commit to look at any rule or regulation that requires more clarity.
Thank you. Professor Cook, you previously stated you agree with the statement the black unemployment rate is a better indicator for the health of the overall economy than a lot more standard metrics that many people use today. Do you still stand by that statement?
Senator, when I think about the unemployment rate in general, it's not just one unemployment rate. There are many different unemployment rates. There are unemployment rates for...
I'm sorry, I'm glad you've gone that direction. I'm about to run out of time. So what specific standard metrics do you believe should be discarded in favor of this or other metrics?
Oh, I don't believe any should be discarded. I think we should, if confirmed, use as many different metrics as possible. The data are imperfect, so we should look at as many different indicators from many different sources, from businesses, from consumers, from everyone in the economy. So I don't believe in primacy of one indicator over another.
Thank you. My time's expired, and we will submit other questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Toomey, and welcome to our three highly qualified and experienced nominees, and congratulations, and thank you for your willingness to serve on the Fed board, especially and particularly in this moment. And I look forward to supporting all three of your nominations. You know, the three nominees here today are highly qualified and dedicated public servants. Your experience and expertise and perspectives are much needed on the Federal Reserve as our nation navigates some really complicated economic times. And I want to say that I appreciated the excellent conversations I've had with all three of you and have found you to be informed and reasonable and qualified and fully committed, I might say, also to following carefully the mandates and the authorities and the independent role of the Fed. Professor Bloom-Raskin, I really appreciated our conversation and your commitment to the value of community banks and small banks. I shared the story of my grandmother, I think, who was the president of a small community bank. And your deep understanding of the value of small banks in a fair and resilient and stable financial system. And I must say, you have been absolutely clear, both in public and in our private conversations, that you emphatically believe that the Fed has no role in picking winners and losers in our economy, including in the oil and gas sector. Maybe this is why, as Chair Brown noted, you have been confirmed with bipartisan support before. Dr. Cook, your experience and perspective on how all sectors of the U.S. economy need to work for everyone, and the role and the responsibilities of the Fed I think are authoritative, and I really appreciated the chance to speak with you. And Dr. Jefferson, your extensive work on poverty and inequality will be invaluable as the Fed pursues its dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices. And I also just want to note, as several have, that we all know that the Fed has traditionally been very short of diverse voices. And it is important, it is vitally important that the Fed include diverse perspectives so that decisions that it makes are going to consider not just whether Wall Street is thriving, but whether Main Street and small businesses and families everywhere in our country are getting ahead. I appreciate that. I believe you will be, all three of you, in the perspective to bring in the position to bring that perspective forward. I just want to hone in a little bit on a few things, Dr. Cook and Dr. Jefferson, to understand how your research and experience will inform your work on the Fed in just the little bit of time I have. Dr. Jefferson, much of your academic research is focused on the labor market, which is very fits so well, and income inequality and poverty, which all of us on this committee, I believe, are concerned about. How will your research inform your work on the Fed, do you think?
Thank you so much for that question, Senator. And one thing that I think it's important for us to do is look at the history of expansions here in the United States. And one thing that we see when we look at our history is that long, non-inflationary expansions are highly inclusive. That is, the longer the expansion, the wider they tend to be, and the more people are brought into employment and prosperity across social economic groups. So if I were confirmed, I would very much want to advocate for policies on the part of the Fed that would lead to long expansions that are non-inflationary.
You're observing also that fairness in our economy is good for our competitiveness. It's good for our productivity. It's good for opportunity, and it gets exactly to. Paul Wellstone was not, as far as I know, an economist, but when he said we all do better when we all do better, I think he was hitting exactly on what you were talking about from an economic perspective. Dr. Cook, I appreciated in your testimony, you said, my approach to complex problems is to be guided by facts and data and analysis and to work collaboratively. You say, I will do my work based on the facts and not politics, and you pointed to Paul Volcker as a person who you admired for his unwavering commitment to a non-political and independent Fed. Could you just say a bit in the 10 seconds I have left on how you'll bring your experience to bear on the Fed?
I'll just say in a word that my experiences abroad have really opened my eyes and informed me about the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve, both unemployment and stable prices, because not all central banks have that dual mandate. They're typically focused on stable prices. And my research also has informed this view through the avenue of innovation, which undergirds economic growth. And what I find is that broadening participation through STEM, for example, in the innovation economy certainly helps us all, not just those individuals who participate. So that's what I would bring to the deliberations on the Fed if confirmed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Van Hollen, I believe you have nobody, right? Senator Van Hollen's recognized from Maryland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Toomey, and welcome all of you, and Dr. Cook, Dr. Jefferson, Governor Bloom-Raskin. Congratulations on your nominations. I think all of you would serve the country very well and our economy well on the Federal Reserve, and I look forward to supporting your nominations. Mr. Chairman, I think you indicated I get just a little bit of leeway in sort of introducing again.
You do, for sure.
Governor Raskin is a Marylander, and I want to thank her for her leadership and focus for a moment about her leadership as Maryland's Commissioner for Financial Regulation during a very difficult time for our state and our country. That was the 2007 to 2010 period. And during that time, she earned the respect of Maryland financial institutions, our community banks, and I've heard from a host of Maryland's community banks about your preparation for the job that you've been nominated for and how well they believe you will serve our country in that capacity. We also have the statement from Camden Fine, who served as the head of the Independent Community Bankers Association, ICBA, during the time that Governor Raskin was the chief bank regulator in the state of Maryland. And I'm quoting Camden Fine saying, "She's outstanding and she understands the role of the Fed governors. She's a tough regulator, don't get me wrong, but she is very fair." It seems that that's exactly the kind of person that we would want in this position, and that sentiment has been endorsed by others who have worked with Governor Raskin. The Conference of State Bank Supervisors noted that she understands firsthand how decisions made in Congress and within the Beltway have significant implications for the financial industry, local communities, and consumers. And 24 state and local treasurers and comptrollers said, "Sarah Bloom Raskin is a lifelong public servant with an exceptional track record as a champion for consumer protection, prudent regulation, and financial risk mitigation." And I've been listening to the testimony, Mr. Chairman, and I think Governor Bloom's answers reflect that she clearly understands that her role is to focus on risk across the board. And we would be doing a great disservice to our country if we asked her to ignore any particular risks in the system or to overly focus on any particular set of risks. She wants to look at all the risks, which is what she did as the Maryland chief bank regulator. And Governor Raskin, if you could just take a moment to talk about how that experience during that very difficult time, we had a meltdown in the subprime mortgage industry in the United States, which created catastrophic economic consequences for American families. Can you talk about how your experience there informs your view of your current job?
Certainly, and Senator Van Hollen, thank you for your remarks and your question, of course. So the role of the Commissioner of Financial Regulation in the state of Maryland in the years that I served, which were the years of the successive waves of foreclosures, the weakening of some non-bank entities, and a general sense of hopelessness, which many of you may remember from the days of the financial crisis, really required an approach that was very collaborative. It was an approach that, for me, became, I think, the hallmark of how you go about regulation and supervision, which is to do it very collaboratively. Supervision, regulation cannot be done with one voice alone. You need the voices of many, and the many include not just experts who understand the theory of regulation and supervision, but the people who experience it, who live it day to day. The bankers in Maryland were my indispensable partners in moving through those hard months. And it was the bankers there that strengthened my sense, not just in the value of collaboration and in the value of working together to achieve good ends, but the importance of community banks. And I just want to say, I just can't say it enough, community banks are one of the finest features that we have in our financial sector. They provide safe and sound financial intermediation. They understand the community, the economies that they lend into in a way that keeps them very sensitive and very attuned to what communities need. So I learned a lot from those experiences as the commissioner during those years, and many of those approaches became for me a way of thinking about how you move forward.
Thank you, Governor Raskin. To my fellow committee members, I can attest to Sarah Bloom Raskin's very good judgment, good temperament, and somebody who looks at all the facts before making a decision. And I really encourage all the members of the committee to support her nomination. And I also, as I said, support the other two nominees who have been presented to the committee as well. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. I believe Senator Ossoff is remote at his office, but I'm not sure. No, he's not. Okay. Senator Toomey, close, and then I'll close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just briefly wrap up my thoughts on this. First of all, I think Professor Jefferson confirmed what I've learned thus far. I think he is eminently qualified, knowledgeable, has the temperament and the experience to be a constructive contributor, and I look forward to supporting his confirmation. With regard to Professor Cook, I'm very disappointed that yet again today I've been unable to elicit any kind of clear response as to how she views the challenges that we face, specifically with regard to the inflation that we have, what kind of tools she would be willing to use, her thoughts on the changes in our economy. There's just no clear answers, and that is disturbing. With respect to Ms. Raskin, I have to say this is one of the most remarkable cases of confirmation conversion I have ever seen, although she doesn't acknowledge the contradiction of what she has said today compared to the things that she has been saying and writing for years. Let me be very, very clear about where this is all heading. If Ms. Raskin is confirmed, there is going to be an effort at the Fed to start with a climate scenario analysis. That's what it's called, and you can be sure that that had better show all kinds of risks, and then the Fed will respond to that analysis. I don't know exactly how. Maybe it'll be increased capital weightings, maybe it'll be exposure limits, but the idea will be to allocate capital away from the heavily carbon-emitting parts of our economy. How do I know that? Because Ms. Raskin has told us this repeatedly, in writing, in videos. We just found a new campaign video she made criticizing the Fed for including energy bonds when they were buying corporate debt. In her message, it was clear that she would have preferred that they exclude that one category. That itself is another example of her advocacy for an allocation of credit. But rather than responding to that, we just kept hearing this scripted mantra that the Fed should not pick winners and losers. But of course, what she has advocated for in speech after speech and other venues is that the Fed should do exactly that. So, Mr. Chairman, it's hard to believe the strength of the conviction that the Fed should not do that which she has advocated the Fed to do for a very long time. With that, I will ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters of opposition and concern to Ms. Raskin's nomination from more than 60 union, energy, business, manufacturing, taxpayer advocates, and women's organizations, 24 state treasurers and auditors, and Senator John Barrasso. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters of opposition to Professor Cook's nomination from 11 taxpayer advocates and women's organizations.
Without objection. It's ordered. Thank you, Senator Toomey. That compares to miserly comparison to the 1,000 letters and calls of support from such a wide cross-section of so many people, including, as Senator Van Hollen says, the Maryland community bankers. There's been a lot of hyperventilating about today's nominees that is based on hyperbole and misrepresentation rather than their actual records and experience. I'll note a couple of things. Sarah Bloom Raskin has a long and distinguished record in public service, making consequential decisions about our economy. She brings a steady hand. She brings a clear-eyed focus. We saw that to serving the American taxpayer. That's why this body has confirmed her unanimously twice, including this committee and the Finance Committee. Her approach and character have not changed one iota since she was nominated last time nominated to serve her country. Nowhere in their record can you find her making policy decisions that fit the character we've heard today of someone who is extreme? She served on the Fed as a governor before. And as a governor, she never advocated for the Fed to allocate private capital. If that's not evidence and proof, what could be? As we've heard today in her own words, Ms. Bloom-Raskin is not in the business of telling banks whom to lend to. She didn't do it before. She said that's not how she views this job. To pretend otherwise is nothing more than a political attack tactic. What she said in the New York Times editorial, and I've read it a number of times, has nothing to do with allocation of private capital. The mainstream view is that regulators need to consider how all banks how all risk could affect banks. Senator Tester's discussion about $140 billion in climate costs just last year alone speaks to that. It is one of those risks. Look at President Trump's vice chair for supervision, the only person that's actually held this job prior to, I hope, a month from now when Governor Raskin is confirmed. Look at Randall Quarles. He developed a strategy for regulators around the world to understand and monitor climate risks while chair of the Financial Stability Board. Ms. Bloom-Raskin will simply continue the work begun by Chair Powell. The attacks on Dr. Cook are abhorrent. They were ginned up on the far-right blogosphere to discredit a highly respected economist with substantial monetary policy experience. She has a PhD in economics. Plenty of other board governors never had that, including prominent ones today. I'm disappointed my Republican colleagues repeat these ugly and baseless lies and spreading fake news. A wide range of organizations, as I've said, have written to the committee in support of her nomination. Instead of these attacks, I hope we can bring the focus back to American workers, putting American workers at the center of our economic policy, something the Fed, frankly, hasn't done through much of its history. Workers finally starting to gain some power and higher wages and real job options in our economy. They're worried these wage gains aren't going to mean much if prices to continue to go up. All three of you, clearly, Dr. Jefferson, Dr. Cook, Governor Raskin, have talked about the importance of combating inflation, putting it at the top. These costs that have been going up for decades, like child care and prescription drugs and housing. Balancing that dual mandate's always a tough job, and as we emerge from the pandemic that's unprecedented in our lifetimes, there's never been more uncertainty in the economy, making these jobs even tougher. Makes it all more important that we have 7 fully confirmed, seated members of the Federal Reserve, thoughtful, experienced nominees. You couldn't sit here today and not be impressed by the thoughtfulness and the experience and the gravitas and the serious-mindedness of these nominees. We need a full Fed board. Hopefully my colleagues will join me in supporting the President's nominees. Thank you again, the three of you. I look forward to supporting all 3 nominations and leading this effort on the Senate floor. I would like to enter into the record letters of support from 1,000 organizations and individuals without objection. For senators who wish to submit questions, these questions are due on Saturday, February 5th at noon to the nominees. We'd like to have your responses by Wednesday, February 9th at noon. Those are real dates, February 5th, February 9th. We want to do this vote on February 15th.